everybody. You may not know it, but I lived in Illinois for 10 long years. And when you drive south of Chicago in Illinois, all there are endless cornfields for hours and hours. It's flat. It's the bottom of the Great Cretaceous Seaway, and it's just endless cornfields. It's a monoculture, and monocultures are extremely dangerous ecologically speaking, right? It's just one kind of plant that grows everywhere. So I think of the modern reduction of all color experiences into RGB is like a long drive through a cornfield. It's boring, it's monotonous, everything's all the same. It homogenizes all human experience into one thing. I'm not the biggest fan of RGB color space. So the point of my talk here is to give you the tools by using a kind of media archaeology strategy first to think about other ways to make color for your own work. And that's the whole point of what I want to talk about. So making color in a way that is not like a long drive through a cornfield. So I divided these group of images up into different printing processes so that because the history of color printing sort of proceeds along with the technologies that promote it until you get to the last 150, 200 years. In each process, each technology has different affordances and leads people to make color in different ways. But the first kind of printing, and I put some of these images in for a more general audience. I think you all know some of this stuff I'm going to show. For example, the first dated printed book, you probably all study this. But one of the things I love to think about when I look at this is the level of accomplishment in this book. So it's the first dated printed book, but really it's amazingly well cut and well drawn and well printed for what it is. So to me, that suggests a long history of this kind of printing before this artifact. And we just don't happen to have any examples of whatever went on before it. And it could well be that there was color printing before this. This is the Diamond Sutra, you know, dated 800s Common Era. But just look at that. I mean, it's a very lively piece of cutting. I think it's masterful. The first kinds of color printing in relief printing were spot color printing. So this whole talk is oriented into dividing color printing into two basic conceptual approaches. One is spot color printing and the other is process color printing. So spot color printing, you're all super familiar with it. It's you make multiple matrices. The matrices then are surprinted onto some kind of substrate, and they have different strategies for producing color. In the simplest form of spot color printing, there's no color produced by overprints. It's just an area that's colored in. So the leaf with a black key line. And I threw that one in to point to this idea of a key line with a color coloring it in. So the black line is the target for all the color printing. The early playing cards to the left of it are a similar sort of idea. I think that's actually printed in three or more colors. But that might have been pochoir rather than relief printing for the color, but the line work was printed from block. So here's some very early examples of these spot color approaches early on. It turns out that pochoir was a really popular way of applying color to relief prints early on. And the famous print on the left there, around 1500, is actually stenciled in color on a block print. And the way you know it's stenciled in color, according to the people who know this stuff, is that you can see the islands that held the floats in place. So they're little dark lines connecting to the unprinted interior of those large letters. So you can imagine a stencil that has little bridges holding the floats in place, and you ink it so that the ink can go underneath the floats. So that's a one color block print, then stenciled in two colors. Stenciling or pochoir at that time was so popular that it was even documented in some woodcuts and books printed. And so the little black and white line image to the right is a human being stenciling in color on prints. And that was dated, you know, in mid 16th century Common Era. But even more popular than that would have been something like the thing in the middle, which is hand-colored and stenciled color. So the urge to make color on prints was really strong from very early on. People love color. And then you probably all know about this. Is the first example of three color printing. The Mainz Psalter with the interlocking capital initial letters that were probably a kind of puzzle print where the two blocks are inked separately, put together and dropped into the form and printed in one impression. So one strategy would be, right, to make separately ink a bunch of different things, put them in together in one form and print it all in one pass. And the register would be much better that way, obviously. But again, this is a spot color idea. So the idea is each matrix, which is inked in a separate color, only produces that color. And then here's the other great example, this very early kind of spot printing. It's not clear to me whether this was stenciled or printed from blocks. The tan color looks to me like it was printed from a block, but the red might have been stenciled. You can see there's a kind of squeeze out at the edge of the tan block, and the red looks much more solid. Of course, the great famous example of pochoir printing is the Prose of the Trans-Siberian. And a lot of contemporary artists use pochoir. And if you're thinking about color production in your own work, there are ways to think about this kind of spot color process in a spot color method in a process way. In fact, a long time ago, I did a book that's actually process pochoir. So this was spray paint. This is a book I did that folds out in this kind of crazy shape, but it's pen registered stencils that I spray painted using process spray paint. So it was a small edition. So the colors are produced by optical blending. So the kind of dirty greens and oranges are really magenta and yellow and cyan printed with a spray paint, which produces a dot pattern. So those don't produce tonality. One of the things I'm interested in, the pochoir can produce some tonality by brushing lightly, but the kind of graphic thinking that it takes to think about how you reproduce tone in printing starts to emerge in the 16th century with chiaroscuro woodcuts, which are woodcuts where people started thinking about cutting the lights and the shadows and then printing them on a gray field. I'm a big fan of chiaroscuro kind of prints, and this is a famous example of these, when is this, 1530 or something. And I de-separated it in Photoshop so you could see what the two blocks probably looked more or less like. So being able to think then about tonal ranges in your printing produces a different kind of idea about what a print can do, right? On the other side of the world around the same time, in the Chinese tradition, there were 5-color and 6-color woodblock prints being made. So this is a very badly faded example of one of the early 5-color prints from the mustard seed garden. And this particular work, this mustard seed garden book, was very influential and influenced Japanese artists. And everybody I think here probably knows about the tradition of multicolor prints in Japan. But it comes from some of this earlier work in China, which I think transmitted the idea of multiple matrices, each printed in a separate color, combined on a keyline print. So the ukiyo-e prints all use a black keyline mostly. There are very few untrapped areas of color, but they also have a tremendous sensitivity to the kind of gradients you can produce on a block using a brush and the kind of viscous rice-based inks they used in Mokuhanga. And this is a pretty good example of blocks being inked with gradients in multiple directions to create tonality. So the tonality is not from the matrix, it's from the inking on the matrix, which I think is a good distinction. And here's another example I picked out of clever use of gradients on a single block surface to produce depth and tonality. There's a little bit of overprinting in this one too. There's, I think, a gray on top of some blue. Mostly though, by the 19th century, the Japanese woodblock printers were making colors through overprint, where two colors combine on the substrate to produce a third color. But mostly that was not how they did it. And I'm sure you've all seen progressive proofs of how these prints are built up from 12, 20 different colors. As a printer, I love looking at these kind of progressive proofs to unpack the logic of the print designer and think about the kind of techniques that they used to produce the colors they got. And in this one, there is, in the waves, on the left-hand one, you can see some overprint color actually happening in the waves through several colors overprint. To get overprint color to work right, of course, you need completely transparent inks. If the inks are opaque at all, the trick doesn't work. I don't know if any of you have seen this William Savage 1822. This is a work that's actually fairly new to me, Practical Hints on Decorative Printing. So in the 1820s, this guy, William Savage, who was an amateur, decided to invent a process for color printing. And it's really prefigures chromolithography, but it's all wood blocks. So at the same time, there were a bunch of people mostly in England and Germany thinking about how you print color in letterpress, because the appetite for color was large and people were trying to invent ways to do it. So this particular book has a section at the end of it that's full of these funny color prints. I think this is a 20 color print. And he struggled because he had opaque pigments. So some of this, the printing is with fairly opaque pigments and some of it with semi-transparent pigments. The biggest problem, of course, is that the drawing and content is so awful, but it was a noble effort. And terrible problems with registration. This is fairly well registered. I'm also interested in the decorative arts and how color emerges in the decorative arts. And you may know that in the late 18th century, early 19th century, there were pictorial wallpapers became very popular. And there's a company in France that's still in business, Zuber, that produced these kind of panoramic wallpaper suites. And they're printed from wood blocks, but they're printed with completely opaque inks. If you go to their website, they have videos of people going down into the dungeon to find these ancient wood blocks. These different suites of wallpaper sometimes were thousands of different blocks that it took to combine to make these big scenes. But I think the way the color is broken is interesting, and it's a kind of posterization, meaning that there are very few levels of gray represented, very levels of value represented in the tonalities, but it creates a kind of sense of tone. Here's one for the American Revolution. This one's from the middle of the 19th century, I think. The other one's maybe early 1850. But you know, from a distance, it starts to look like continuous tone. But up close, of course, it's very posterized. So the final part of that story about color and relief printing goes into photomechanical processes, and that's where that all went after about 1870, 1880. But the intaglio world got into process color much sooner. So I don't know if you've ever seen this. This is a Dutch studio that did a lot of color engravings inked a la poupée. So this particular artist did a lot of work with local inking of a single plate. And you can see that it's not very accurate, but the overall effect is sort of charming. And this is one of the really big masterpieces. That's all from one plate, very carefully inked by hand to create these different values of color. And at this time, the matrix itself was producing tone. So the cross-hatching in this print creates the illusion of tone. So then you have a range of values of a single color. So I think that's an important breakthrough idea, that you could, by selectively inking, cross-hatching in an engraving or an etching, you can then produce a range of colors. So that's in the back of somebody's head at this time. And the invention of the mezzotint opened up a whole different world of thinking about how you can produce color. So mezzotint, which I'm sure you all know what it is an intaglio plate that's been rocked to produce a field of even burrs. And in the subtractive method, you polish down the highlights. So you can produce a range of tones by polishing down how big the burr is. And so on the right-hand side, you can see the little stylus used to push down the burr after you've carefully raised it all over the plate. And there's a close-up of a rocker going back and forth. I've actually never done this because it seems tedious beyond all reason. So here's, I think, one of the first dated mezzotints with a close-up of it. And you can see that the rocking pattern leaves a kind of pattern in the image. And the early was an additive process where you didn't rock the whole plate, but you did, I guess, selective rocking. And then it became the full subtractive method. So sometime in the 17th century, the guy who is now, I think, going to be credited as the inventor of process printing, Leblanc, who actually lives in England. He's got a mess of a history. Comes up with the idea that color can be reduced to a limited set of colors, and you can make all colors out of a set of primaries. So this is the same time Newton has published his work about white light being composed of lots of other colors of light. So there's no good evidence that Leblanc actually knew much about Newton, but it's the same idea. It's the idea that you can make a large number of colors out of a limited number of colors. And he thinks that you only need 3 colors, yellow, red, and blue, which he calls primitives and we call primaries, to reproduce anything, any set of colors. And so I'm going to use the word gamut now to talk about the range and number of colors that you can make out of a set of primaries. So in this little book, Colorito, which has been digitized and available for your entertainment on the Internet Archive, and it's very short, so it's worth reading, he attached at the back of the book some examples of his process color printing. So the plates from the book are across the top, and the first one is just the plate printed in black. And he did some tricky things here. So the second one, somebody's painted over a different color separation. So the first and the second one are 2 different plates. In the third print are those 2 plates overprinted with some cheating going on. So thinking about it, I assume that the first plate really is supposed to represent the red image. The second plate, let's pretend that's some neutral or dark value. So I took those 2 plates, made them monochrome, then turned them into color. So the things across the bottom is something I made to try to demonstrate the principle he's supposedly demonstrating. So my version of his overprint, her pupils, the irises of her eyes are blood red because they're dark in the first plate. But the skin tones and the hair seem to be carrying the right kind of color, and her lips are red. The final print here, number 6 in this illustration, somebody's actually gone in with paint and painted on it to make it look right. Furthermore, the third print, number 3 there, somebody has cut out or somehow removed the red from her eyes so that her eyes don't look blood red, which produces, in my little version of this, a kind of interesting vampire look. So what is this? So it's somebody doing an analysis of a range of colors, basically in their head, and then producing 2 sets of printing plates that, when overprinted, produce a range of representational color. This is the big breakthrough in thinking about how you make color in a process way. So here's another of Leblanc's prints. This is from a painting. Almost all the things that I could find or have seen are based on paintings. So the mezzotint, because it has this ability to produce a range of values for a single ink, allows you to think analytically about a color scene and think how much yellow is here and how much yellow is there, and then produce a plate that represents those different values of that primary color. Now, for reasons of who knows why, this was yellow, green, red, and a kind of dark color, sort of dark brown. And when it's overprinted, I messed around with it to try to get the color to balance better. So this one image here has a good bit of digital manipulation in it to make it work. But there's a kind of sense of a red skull cap, flesh tones, a kind of gray hair that's clearly talking about the sorts of color palettes or gamuts you'd find in a painting.
So Cliff, when they were doing these early color separations, were they just having to guesstimate how much of each color to put where?
Yes. I can think of practical, like little experimental things you could try. If you had 3, like say you're working with oil paint and you have the 3 colors, you could try mixing them on a palette and painting it out to see what color it would make. And from that, you could guess that it would need to be, strongly red, half strength yellow, and just a little bit of green. And that kind of back of an envelope calculation. And the color isn't great, right? But it is kind of amazing that it works at all. So there must have been a key plate somebody made that printed onto the copper plates so that it would register. And you think about registering four mesotints onto one piece of paper, the paper stretch, there'd be all kinds of problems. It would be nightmarish, I think. But oddly enough, by the end of the 18th century, there was a huge industry in France of highly accomplished mesotint printers who did 5 and 6 color mesotints as book illustrations. This is Descourtis, who was probably the master of it. And this is a progressive from, I think it's from a book called Paul et Virginie, 1790s. And you can see part of their strategy here. So it's between Descourtis and Leblanc, there's a couple of generations of people who worked in color printmaking, particularly in mesotints and intaglio. And it's, so this is the end of a long period of development. This is 1790s. Leblanc is much earlier, so there's been a couple of generations of artists working in there. And you know, these aren't great images, but they're amazing pieces of printing. So there's this dirty blue, yellow, an orange, a red that's really just used for spot color. And then the 4-color overprint, I found this progressive somewhere of it, is actually very fuzzy. So one of the clever things they did were, because the registration in mesotint and in intaglio printing is so tough, there's only one plate that's sharp and everything else is sort of fuzzy. So that if it doesn't fit right, it doesn't look terrible. In fact, it looks pretty good. So here's the whole plate of that image.
Cliff, do you have any sense of how much proofing they had to do to see if they were in the right ballpark with how much color was on each plate?
I
Like,
would guess a lot. I would
so you
guess they
can,
probably
yeah,
adjusted ink strength. You know, they would take a yellow ink and either put base in it or something to make it lighter to get the balance right.
but there's no documentation about
I
anybody's
can't,
proofing.
there's not very much written about this particular person in his studio. So Descourtis really accomplished, did a lot of printing. There's some stuff in French, but I can't find copies of it anywhere. So, and again, I'm not actually a scholar of this stuff. I'm an artist who uses media archaeology as a cheat to figure out new ideas. So there's the 3-color, no, that's the 4-color overprint without the key plate. And I mean, it's amazing to me. One of the things that's important to notice that is the 4-color overprints don't get very dark. And that's a problem we're going to talk about for the Riso, is it doesn't get to very solid ink in the shadows because you have this plate that's going to come down on top of that and produce the values out of the colors. The color overprints really produce color, and then this key plate, I think, hangs it all together. So, you know, beginning of the 19th century, Sinnefelder introduces lithography, and it's an even easier way to produce tonal images. And I don't know if, I assume you've all had some lithographic experience. Lithography is my jam. So this is where I am a happy person. It's autographic. You can look at this Manet drawing and just sense him scribbling with a crayon on a stone, and the stone producing those tonal marks very directly. So it's super direct. It's easy to make tonal areas lithographically. Printing a hand lithograph is kind of a nightmare. But by the 1840s, 1850s, something called chromolithography had really taken off because it was relatively easy, much easier than the intaglio methods, to produce ranges of values of an ink. So here's Louis Prang was an American chromolithographer, often considered the greatest chromolithographer in America, at least. And chromolithography probably reaches its apex in America in the second half of the 19th century. There's a really tremendous book on the history of chromolithography. Michael Twyman, I believe it's called The History of Chromolithography, which is a wonderful book. But here's a sales piece that Prang's Litho Company, who mostly made labels and greeting cards, did to sell their products. So this is the keyline drawing from a very ugly painting of a bunch of babies that is a color map for the 24 colors they're going to print to build this up. So here are a whole bunch of the color progressive proofs. And the way I've arranged this, it's in 2 columns. and I have the plate and then the overprint mixture. So it goes from upper left-hand corner to bottom right-hand corner, slowly building up values. So if you look at their strategy in building up color, they start very light. They're very gradual in adding tone and value, partially because I think the inks they were using weren't entirely transparent, and they had blocking problems as colors built up. So one color wouldn't let you see the one underneath it. And so here's, so there's 19, the one on the right is 19 colors built up. And the register's pretty good. It's intentionally a little sloppy. There's a certain amount of scraping of highlights. So the highlights on the, let's call it a chemise of the child are scraped into one of the color blocks. So it's not entirely drawn. There's some reduction as well, a little mesotent thinking. But if you think about the way you had to think about color to make something like this, it's an amazing accomplishment. You know, it would take a lot of experience with color mixture, looking at something, breaking it up in your mind, thinking about how to draw it on a stone to get that to work. And so the great piece, the final thing that Prang did before he sold his business and gave up, was in the 1890s, and a guy named Walters had a collection of ceramics, and he wanted a portfolio printed that would be the best possible representation of his collection. And so this was a 10-year project to produce a portfolio of these chromolithographic prints of these vases. And there were two principal artists who went, observed the vases and did watercolors of them, and then a huge team of people who did the color analysis of the watercolors. Some of these prints are 40 colors. It cost, in today's money, I think it was millions of dollars they spent on this project. There was an equivalent thing in photography when I was a young printer. The Gilman Paper Company wanted to have a catalog printed of their photographic collection. So they went to Richard Benson, who was one of the great duotone makers in America in the 1980s and 1990s, and commissioned him to do this book. And he built a building, bought printing presses, and that's all he did for 2 years. Was him and his assistant did very high quality photographic reproductions of this Gilman Paper Company photo collection. You probably know Richard Benson got a MacArthur for his duotone, so he's one of the few people in the offset printing world who got a MacArthur for some reason. He also went on to be dean of the Yale Art School. So there's that. So this is an example of something, this is a piece of my own from a book that's a chromolithographic approach to photography. So I broke up photographic color images into kind of semi-duotone, color separations, and printed them in non-standard colors. So that's a 4-color print, but it's 2 blacks, a tan, and a blue to create a kind of range of color that talks towards a color image. So this is just to show you why I'm interested in all this stuff. Is I'm only doing it so I can steal somebody else's ideas. So chromolithography was labor intensive, very expensive to produce, and the market for color in America was exploding. So some of the color theorists, there were photographers at this time, Lucas du Horon, Maxwell, in the 1860s and 70s, who understood color theory and maybe knew something about Leblanc, but adopted those ideas into printing. So this is a 3-color lithograph that all of a sudden makes a very large gamut of colors out of very few press impressions. So the Prang chromolithographs, 20 runs on a press, now get reproduced in maybe 3 or 4 impressions. And about the same time, the first color comics get printed. And has anybody ever seen this? This is the first color comic ever printed in a newspaper. So it's the first comic of the Yellow Kid, which was actually called Hogan's Alley at the time. And it's done with an interesting photomechanical trick. Ben-Day dots were a mechanical process for producing tone. So I'll describe it really fast. So it's a mat of gelatin pyramids, very small, that you completely ink up. and then you put a substrate on top of it, and you push down against this gelatin mat of pyramids. And the harder you push, the bigger the dots got. So you could sort of draw on the back of a piece of substrate, and if you press lightly, you'd get tiny little dots, right? The tips of the pyramids. And as you push down, you compress the pyramids, and it made bigger and bigger dots. So it's a completely mechanical way of making a halftone dot to produce color. So they knew about process color. They had this mechanical method for making halftone dots from a Bende mat, and that was the way they produced the separations for this kind of thing. It's a black key line with applied three color, yellow, blue, and some kind of magenta red. So the introduction of photography into printmaking was the bigger breakthrough. There's the first color photograph. That's Maxwell's famous picture of a tartan ribbon from the 1860s. The principles were well understood. People understood how to do this. They understood the theory of it. Nobody knew how to do it. But Maxwell took 3 photographs of a colored tartan ribbon through 3 different filters, then made 3 positives, set up 3 projectors, put the filters back in front of the projectors, aimed the 3 projectors so the images coincided, and got a kind of color image. I guess everybody knows this additive subtractive color theory. Is that right? It's not very tricky. Light has 3 primaries, red, green, and blue, and when combined, they make white light. A really entertaining thing to do in your home is to get a red, green, blue light bulb, put it in one fixture, and you can turn them all on, it makes white light, and turn one off and you get the different mixtures. I used to do that with my kids. Those are all the complements of yellow, magenta, and cyan. So red is the complement of cyan, green is the complement of magenta, and blue is the complement of yellow, meaning when they mix, they make a neutral color, a neutral density. I usually, when I teach color theory to undergraduates, I go on and on about how they've been lied to their whole lives, that red, yellow, and blue are not primaries, those are secondary colors, and that you can prove it because if you mix them, you get brown, you don't get a neutral density. So red is a secondary color in pigment, right? It's a mixture of yellow and magenta. Blue is a mixture of cyan and magenta, and it makes them, if you have a good audience, it makes them slightly crazy. So here's Luca Durand's color photographs. So he's a little after Maxwell, and he has a camera. They're finally making film that's sensitive to all wavelengths of light, which is another whole problem. And he takes pictures of funny things, sometimes little still lives, scenes, making 3 negatives through 3 different filters, and he has no way to print them. At that time, there's absolutely nothing you could do except put the slides in a projector, put the filter over the projector, 3 projectors, and project the images so they coincided to make an overlapped image. And that remained true for quite a while. One of the early pioneers in all this is this Prokudin Gorsky, who is a photographer in Russia, active up until the Bolshevik Revolution. The Tsar commissioned him in about 1905 to travel around the Russian Empire at that time and photograph all the citizens and things of his empire, and to do it in color. So he had a camera with 3 filters mounted on a slide, and he could take 3 exposures fairly rapidly through 3 different filters, separating the color images. This is one of the best ones. This is the Emir of Bukhara, who held remarkably still. These separation negatives somehow wound up in the Library of Congress. And you can go to the Library of Congress and look for the Prokudin Gorsky collection. There are about 2,000 images of Tsarist Russia that I, of course, found fascinating. So here's some kids on a hillside. And unlike the Emir of Bukhara, who seemed well capable of sitting still for long periods of time, the kids are moving around, and you can see their doubled images in there. He didn't have any way to print this, really. They had a viewing device that was much like a projector with the 3 slides that you could kind of look into. The Tsar viewed these images with his family as projected images on a screen. The way to print them was slowly emerging during the 1890s. because there was such interest in color, people were trying to figure out ways to make color photography cheaper and more accessible to everybody. And one of the big technical breakthroughs that allowed ordinary people to make color images sometime right after the turn of the century, 1910, maybe 1905, was something called autochrome. And this was a brilliant idea I think it was the Lumiere brothers actually came up with, which was it's a piece of photographic film on a glass plate that on one side of it, starch grains have been dyed red or sort of orange, violet, and green and scattered on the back of this glass plate. And you would photograph a scene through that screen. So it's a filter that produces color separation. So each little spot then acts as a color separation filter and produces the scene in color. You process that as a positive, and then you could view it back through the filter it was shot through, much like the three projectors projecting the three color separation images. They're all contained on one slide. If you look at National Geographic magazines from the 19-teens, all the color in there was shot on autochrome, and it has a really funny particular palette. And one of the things that happens is the silver image is blocking light through the filters. So it adds density. So the more saturated a color is, the more black it has in the color. So really intense colors tend to look really dingy, and lighter colors look purer because there's less silver image blocking it. So if you look at the picture of the couple there, their flesh tones look kind of dead, but the apple and the picture look sort of funny because those were probably very bright primary colors and they look darker than they would otherwise. So at the one hand, color photography is progressing and getting more and more technically sophisticated at producing color. And then printing technology is starting to catch up with it during the 1780s and 90s. This is the first image printed in a newspaper. And the breakthrough that makes all this possible is the invention of the halftone. So reliable, easy ways of producing dots or lines of varying thickness that when viewed from a distance create tone. And there's an example here at the top left of a line art, a straight line screen, a square dot screen, various kinds of screens. The first printed color image is a 3-color natural color print, which you can see the greens really look terrible, which is always a problem in CMYK. Greens look awful. But this was at the point where color printing from photographic originals starts to explode.